Um, I'm Sven Teurlincx. I work at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. We are not a institute tasked with monitoring the environment per se. We're just a bunch of scientists that happen to work on environmental questions. We're part of the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. So we're traditionally quite a fundamental institute, but increasingly you can't work on the environment and not be involved in things that lead to impact, I would say, because people are clearly worried about the environment and care about it. So by definition, our work has gotten increasingly more societal focused. I quite like that, to be honest. I've done societally relevant research for 14 years, so I'm quite happy to be there. I titled this Better Citizen Data, More Impact for Society, ? I'm going to start with pollinators. I should say, before I do so, I am an aquatic ecologist, so I tend to work on water. I'll get back to water. But we'll start with pollinators in the Netherlands, and specifically when we talk about pollinators, the policy context there until last year was really the Habitat Directive and municipal biodiversity plans. So in the Netherlands, essentially we have to comply with European legislation, obviously, but then the European legislation didn't say a lot about what had to happen by when. So for the most part, for pollinators, we were dependent on what local municipalities would think up that they wanted to do. And if you think how local, well, the Netherlands isn't that big and we have over 360 municipalities. So there's quite a lot of different local actors at play there. If we look at what we know about pollinator decline in the Netherlands, actually on a national scale, we have been collecting data for over 30 years. That is largely coordinated by an NGO, the Vlinderstichting, so the Butterfly Association, but also increasingly other NGOs have gotten involved in trying to get information on rare species decline. And what we see on the left here is our general trend of butterfly decline, which is clearly not doing great. And on the right, we see that threatened species increasingly become more threatened. Where in 2003, we had quite a few. We now have even more in 2018, and I haven't seen the most recent picture, but I'm fairly sure it's not looking better, sadly enough. So probably a recognizable image for you guys. Now, the good news is we have a lot of data. So we have more than 30 years of data that is all collected by citizen scientists. That has been standardized over the years, that is checked by the Dutch Bureau for Statistics. So the government accepts all that data. No one is questioning the quality of the data in and of itself. So obviously, we're going to solve the problem, right? Sadly enough, as we have seen, that doesn't seem to actually happen. But the good news is, sorry, I should say one more positive thing before I do that. Namely, all of that data even led to it being incorporated into an indicator for the Nature Restoration Regulation, the Grassland Butterfly Index, very much used, brought up by this long-term citizen science collection. So all good news, and obviously now we get the policy action. But if we look at that, policy action is pretty low on the priority list, generally speaking, in terms of pollinators in the Netherlands. That has all sorts of underlying political reasons, but more than anything, we see that also there's not a real clear idea of what to actually do locally, because we do have a pretty good idea of the global, or I should say national drivers of change, from climate change to pesticides, etc. But what do you then really do locally? Is pesticides the main problem? Is it something else? Is it land use change? And all these things are difficult topics in a country that is fairly full in terms of people. So if you want to change land use, that's not so much about pollinators, that's about all sorts of things, from agricultural practice to room for housing, you name it. So actually, weirdly enough, when you start talking about pollinators, you're actually talking about the whole spatial planning of the Netherlands all of a sudden. So despite all that amazing data, the real bottleneck we see is in taking action on the ground. And a very important one there is the link with the policy. I already mentioned the Habitat Directive. The Habitat Directive does not force us to do anything, really, if it boils down to it. There's no clear deadline. And hopefully now with the nature restoration regulation, we at least have a clear indicator and we have a clear deadline. So maybe that will make some change. But that's a very important one that came up while working on pollinators, that we increasingly see. If the law doesn't even ask you to do something, there's all sorts of reasons locally to not do anything, despite all the best intentions and all the good data. So now let's shift to water. Freshwater ecology and quality. This is, for me, much more natural. I feel much more like a fish in water here. The policy context when looking at this is the Water Framework Directive that has been in force since 2000. There's a deadline coming up in 2027. And this is quite clear, quite strict. If we look at water quality in the Netherlands, essentially this is the map of our current ecological status, and good luck finding the green. By 2027, all of this should be green. For obvious reasons, you can probably imagine that that isn't happening. At the same time, what we do see is that we monitor officially in 741 water bodies. So the monitoring is quite well placed and is being taken care of by regional and national authorities. That monitoring consists of monitoring hundreds of different species groups that are quite specific to identify. So we're not talking about things that are easily done even with AI at the moment. So you can't just take a nice picture and you get it. Then there's over 160 chemicals, some of them being measured in nanograms per liter. So they need specific devices, accredited laboratories, you name it. Clearly, this is not something that's easily done with citizens. So then you could say, well, apparently in water quality and ecology in water, there's not a lot of room for citizen science. I'll try and make the inverse claim and see what happens. Because beyond those Water Framework Directive water bodies, of which we have 741, we have quite a lot of waters that do not actually have mandatory monitoring on them. Water bodies are about 1/3 of the total water surface area of the Netherlands in comparison to the Water Framework Directive water bodies. So quite a substantial amount. And what you might have already thought up when you look at a lot of those water bodies is actually they're the type of waters that are very close to people's homes. So the big parts of the ocean, the larger lakes, sure, there's some people living there, but there's also a lot of people living near small ditches, local ponds, canals, you name it. Very Dutch, can't help it. Obviously, people have a connection to these waters, and very often they're also not in amazing conditions. So we focused in on those water bodies, and we started the campaign named Catch the Water Monster, which in Dutch works very nicely because monster is also sample. So it's catch the water sample, but it's also catch that monster in the water. And we ran that campaign from 2019 to 2023. Together with a lot of partners, and the idea was, can we measure ecology and water quality with citizens in the Netherlands? And we really focused in on co-designing our methods together with the water authorities, because we wanted it to yield something that would say something relevant about the Water Framework Directive, essentially, while being fully aware that we were never ever going to meet the standard that we needed for the Water Framework Directive legislation. So we knew we weren't able to do what that legislation asked, but we still want to see how far can we get, what can we do, and how can we still make an impact there. In all of this, we collaborated very closely with an environmental NGO, Natuur en Milieu, and I'll get back to that, why I think that was so relevant. Just to give you a small overview, we're not reaching the same amount of participants as Hester has, but we got pretty close near the end. We did take 5 years to really get, well, I think about 3 years to get to a really good method of doing this, because you live and learn and you make a lot of mistakes along the way. And I think that's actually really relevant to be aware of. We did some measurements on water clarity, letting people color in old CDs and putting them on a stick. All worked pretty well. We let them say something about the plant life. Now, obviously, people are not experts on all sorts of plants, and they don't really need to be, because we really wanted them to tell us the difference between the left and the right. To do so, we used all sorts of simplified measures. So if the professional measurement person from the water authority goes out, they have to measure everything in about 12 to 14 categories. We gave people 5. They were able to deal with that. We were able to translate them back to something that was semi-usable in the context of the Water Framework Directive. We did not focus in on species. We really just went for functional groups. Is this thing covered by duckweed? Is there stuff underneath the water column? That sort of thing. Then we also worked with nutrient measurements, and we started off using nitrate strips, which seemed like a really good idea. In practice, these things had absolutely no usable detection limits to say something meaningful in most cases. And also people took them out of the canister after a few days and they were already discolored. Essentially, it was one big pile of poop, quite literally on occasion, if we would have used that data. Instead, what we went back to is, okay, how would we do it normally? Normally, we measure this in a lab. We take a sample, and can we also just ask people to send us samples to the lab? And then we know that the chemical analysis essentially isn't the problem anymore. So we asked people to collect these data in little tubes. They sent them to us, and then we ended up with many tubes that all needed analyzing, but at least no one thought, hey, the data is not good enough quality, because if you didn't trust these outcomes, you wouldn't trust any other outcomes that came out of our lab. So that really helped to give people confidence in, okay, the measurements are not the issue. Now the question is, do we like the end result? We also let people sample with a dip net and let them look at different little critters in the water, so small animals, macroinvertebrates, so snails, insects, that sort of thing. And that took quite a few years to get that to a point where we were actually able to use the data. But one of the things we noticed time and time again when we did evaluation is people really like doing this. So we kept it in the campaign all throughout, because people really wanted to fish for insects, because it gave them such a nice idea of that water was alive. At the same time, we needed at least 4 years to get to the point where we thought, okay, we now have confidence in the data, up to the point where we really went into the field together with our citizen scientists and looked at the same tray of insects that they fished up to see what do they actually recognize and what don't they. And that's a nice bridge to validation. A very important aspect very early on in the process was validation. We kept going out and doing the same sites that our citizens did. That helped the water authorities to make a case, hey, what these people are finding is actually usable and useful. It's not just because the first thing people want to talk about is, the data quality is never going to be up to specs. It's never going to be good enough. And what they base that on is pretty random. That is the idea that probably we can do it better ourselves. Yeah, I'm sure you can, but citizens can do a pretty damn good job. By doing that validation, we also empowered the NGO that we worked with to be able to say something about what came out of the research. If we would not have done that validation, a lot of the discourse would have been about, well, can we really trust the data? Whereas now the discourse was about the outcome. What does the water quality look like? Which is the conversation we wanted to have. These are the results. We had to translate them into something that most citizens could understand. So we went for a traffic light. Green is good, yellow is not so good, and red is really bad. In a nutshell, the end result was pretty comparable to the map you saw earlier. Good is very hard to find. Most is not doing great. That message was essentially the message we came out with 5 years in a row. And at some point, the NGO even told us, well, don't we have anything new to talk about? No, it's still this. In 5 years, it did not magically get a lot better. Nonetheless, that message, as Hester already mentioned earlier, is quite interesting for media. They really want to hear that. And that in turn allows us to make impact. Namely, on one hand, the NGO Natuur en Milieu was able to do a lot of lobbying at an EU, but mostly at a national government level, to bring this to the attention. So we always aligned when our scientific report came out with important moments in national politics. When there was, for instance, a debate on water scheduled. So we would then come out with the report, the scientific report, the NGO would pick it up for a nice, let's call it, provocative news article that was put into the world, and then based on that, and that would come out 1 or 2 days before that debate. So that's very nicely placed. We always disconnected the scientific report from the news items, because I think the science needs to speak for itself and needs to have its own voice. And then how people translate that is really a different type of work. Next, what we also saw happening was that in the regional water authorities, there was quite a lot of internal lobbying by the regional water managers to their own board members. But sometimes also vice versa. Sometimes the board members would pick up our results that we would always put openly on the website. Everyone could look at every single site. It's all available. Do with it what you want. And say, hey, I see that we're scoring worse than that other water authority. What's going on with us? So that was a really nice feedback in both directions to get the conversation started. And then, of course, there's the educational impact, the awareness raising with the general public, both through the media, but also by all these citizen scientists that would just talk about what they were doing for us at local birthday parties, you name it. So there's a huge value there that we should not discredit either. And that is essentially what I would like to give you as a take-home message. Yes, good data matters. The data needs to be good enough. But we don't necessarily always need to get the data to a standard that it is purely usable within the context of legislation. We can also use the data for more promotion of a topic. And then there's all sorts of ways around the data quality as an issue. Lastly, not unimportantly, you really want to team up. We as a scientific institute, we can do the science real well. We also have credibility in doing the science, but we don't want to lobby. That's not our job. That's someone else's job. And by teaming up, you can align that. And yes, that is sometimes a awkward and even uncomfortable process, which takes a lot of getting used to. And that's what I have for you.